Blood and silver built the West, but it was forged on the broken backs of those forgotten by God and the law. The year was 1876, and in the freezing, gold-dusted mud of Greenwood, Colorado, a human life was worth exactly $42. That was the price Ruth Miller put on her own flesh and blood. To the civilized world, a mother's love is supposedly sacred, an unbreakable bond. But when the brutal winter winds howl and the mining money dries up, starvation has a terrifying way of stripping away humanity. This is the true, unvarnished story of a girl deemed utterly useless, sold into a waking nightmare, and the solitary, scarred ghost of a man who descended from the high peaks to shatter her chains forever. The air in Greenwood tasted of sulfur, wood smoke, and the desperate sweat of men trying to carve a fortune from the Rocky Mountains. For 19-year-old Josephine Josie Miller, the bustling mining camp was a prison of endless toil. She was not a classic beauty of the era. A severe bout of scarlet fever in her childhood had left her with a slight, permanent drag in her left leg and a quiet, withdrawn demeanor. In the harsh arithmetic of the frontier, a girl who couldn't easily secure a wealthy husband or work 14 hours on her feet in a boarding house was considered a liability. Her mother, Ruth Miller, made sure Josie knew this every single day. Ruth was a woman hardened to stone by the West. Since Josie's father had died in a rockfall at the Lebanon mine 3 years prior, Ruth had struggled to keep their small, drafty cabin on the edge of town. Debts had piled up at the mercantile, and the harsh winter of '76 was closing in fast. Ruth had tried to marry Josie off to a string of older, unsavory men, but Josie's quiet defiance and her physical limp had driven them away. "You are a stone around my neck, Josephine," Ruth would often hiss, scrubbing pots until her knuckles bled. "A useless, broken thing. I feed you. And for what?" Josie bore the verbal lashings in silence, doing whatever she could to mend clothes, chop kindling, and keep the fire burning. She believed, with the naive hope of a daughter, that her mother's cruelty was simply born of grief and poverty. She believed they were still a family. That delusion shattered on a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. Josie had been out back, trying to pry frozen roots from the garden dirt, when she was called inside. The cabin smelled strongly of cheap bay rum and stale cigar smoke. Standing in the center of their tiny parlor was Bartholomew Sweeney. Sweeney was a man of notorious reputation in Greenwood. He owned the Silver Nugget, a sprawling, 2-story saloon and brothel down on 6th Street. He was a massive, sweating man with a thick neck and eyes that appraised human beings the same way a butcher appraised a side of beef. "She's small," Sweeney grunted, looking Josie up and down as she stood shivering in the doorway, dirt under her fingernails. "And she drags that leg." "She cleans well enough," Ruth replied, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. She stood by the table, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "And she's quiet. You won't have no trouble out of her. $45, Bart. That covers my tab and gives me enough to get a stagecoach ticket out to Denver before the pass snows over." Josie's breath hitched in her throat. The room seemed to tilt. "Mother, what? What is he doing here?" "You're going with Mr. Sweeney, Josephine," Ruth said, not meeting her daughter's eyes. "I've signed over your labor. You belong to the Silver Nugget now." "Mother, please." Josie stepped forward, the reality of the words crashing over her. Women who went to the Silver Nugget rarely saw the light of day. They were swallowed by the vice, the violence, and the endless stream of drunken miners. "You can't." "I'll work harder. I'll find washing to do." "You are useless to me here," Ruth snapped, slamming a hand on the table. "You cost more to feed than you bring in. It's done. I'm leaving for Denver tomorrow, and you are going with him." Sweeney didn't wait for further argument. He reached into his heavy wool coat and tossed a small stack of greenbacks onto the table. $42, Sweeney corrected, his voice like grinding gravel. "Docking 3 for the limp. Take it or leave it, Ruth." Ruth stared at the money. Her jaw tightened, but she reached out and scooped the bills into her apron pocket. She had just traded her daughter's life for less than the cost of a good draft horse. Sweeney crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his thick, heavy hand wrapping around Josie's upper arm like an iron vise. His grip was bruising, absolute. "Come along, girl. You've got floors to scrub tonight, and if you clean up nice, maybe I'll move you upstairs by the weekend." Josie fought, digging her worn boots into the floorboards, looking back at the woman who had brought her into the world. "Mother, look at me. Don't let him take me." But Ruth Miller simply turned her back, walking toward the cast-iron stove to stoke the fire, deaf to the screams of the useless daughter she had just sold into hell. The silver nugget was a suffocating descent into chaos. Sweeney dragged Josie through the mud of 6th Street, ignoring the stares of the townsfolk who knew exactly what a girl being hauled to Sweeney's establishment meant. The law in Greenwood was loose, bought and paid for by men with silver claims and saloon profits. No deputy stepped in to ask questions. Upon arriving, Josie was shoved into a windowless back room that smelled of mildew, cheap perfume, and vomit. Sweeney threw a garish, overly tight crimson dress onto a cot in the corner. "Wash your face, put that on, and get out into the main hall," Sweeney ordered, his heavy breath washing over her face. "You start by serving drinks. If you spill a drop, I take it out of your hide. If a paying customer grabs you, you smile. Do we have an understanding?" Josie was paralyzed with terror. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Sweeney locked the heavy oak door behind him, leaving her alone in the dim light. For an hour, she sat on the cot, trembling uncontrollably. The sounds of the saloon bleeding through the walls were terrifying, the raucous laughter, the breaking glass, the heavy stomping of boots to a frantic piano tune. She looked at the red dress. It wasn't just a garment, it was a brand. If she put it on, if she walked out there, she would cease to be Josephine Miller. She would be Sweeney's property, completely and utterly. She examined the room. There were no windows, only the locked door leading to the main hall, and a small, narrow coal chute near the ceiling that fed the iron stove in the corner. It was impossibly small, crusted with soot and ice, opening out into the alley behind the saloon. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from the main hall, followed by shouting. A bar brawl had erupted. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the walls shook the dust from the ceiling of Josie's room. Gunfire cracked once, twice sending a wave of screaming panic through the establishment. Josie knew this was her only chance. If she stayed, she was dead in every way that mattered. Ignoring the red dress, she dragged the cot to the wall under the coal chute. Her bad leg screamed in protest, but adrenaline flooded her veins. She climbed onto the wobbly cot, reaching for the iron latch of the chute. Her fingers were raw, and the metal was freezing, but she managed to pry it open. A blast of biting, sub-zero wind hit her face. A blizzard was rolling in off the mountains. She squeezed her head and shoulders through the narrow gap. The soot scraped her skin, and her old canvas dress tore at the seams. Panic seized her as her hips caught, but another gunshot from the saloon gave her the frantic strength to push through. She tumbled headfirst into the snow-filled alley, landing hard on the frozen mud. She didn't stop to catch her breath. Josie scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't run toward the main street. Sweeney's men would find her there. She couldn't go to the sheriff, and she certainly couldn't go home to the mother who had sold her. There was only one direction left. Up. Josie fled toward the tree line, aiming for the treacherous, winding mining trails that led up toward the towering, jagged peaks of Gray's Peak and Mount Evans. She was wearing nothing but a thin canvas dress, a threadbare shawl, and worn leather boots. The temperature was dropping rapidly, plummeting past zero. The snow was beginning to fall heavily, thick white flakes that blinded her and quickly covered her tracks. She climbed for hours. The elevation stole her breath, and her injured leg felt like it was made of lead. The wind howled through the skeletal pine trees like a chorus of dying men. Her hands went numb, then her feet. The cold was a physical beast, gnawing at her flesh, sinking its teeth into her bones. Useless. Her mother's voice echoed in the howling wind. "A stone around my neck. I won't die for them," Josie whispered through cracked blue lips, though there was no one to hear her. "I won't." By nightfall, the blizzard was fully upon the mountain. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The snow was up to her knees, dragging her down. Josie's mind began to play tricks on her. She saw the warm glow of a hearth fire in the empty snowbanks. She heard her father singing old mining shanties in the rustling pines. The pain of the cold slowly faded, replaced by a dangerous, seductive warmth. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into a massive snowdrift at the base of an ancient, twisted spruce tree. She lacked the strength to stand back up. The snow began to bury her, blanketing her small, trembling frame in a grave of white. As her vision faded to black, Josie closed her eyes, accepting that the mountain had claimed what the town had thrown away. Gideon Cross did not like people. He liked the silence of the high country, the predictability of the seasons, and the honest brutality of nature. At 34, Gideon was a man carved from the very granite of the Rocky Mountains. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and heavily scarred both visibly across his jawline from a grizzly bear encounter years ago, and invisibly from the blood-soaked trenches of the Civil War. When the war ended, he had walked away from society entirely, building a heavily fortified, isolated cabin near the timberline of Gray's Peak, far above the madness of the Silver Rush. He came down to Greenwood twice a year to trade furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition. The rest of the time, his only companions were the towering pines and a massive half-wolf dog named Silas. Wait, checking constraints. Cannot use the name Silas. Correcting immediately. A massive, half-wolf dog named Buster. It was near midnight, and the blizzard was raging with a fury Gideon hadn't seen in years. He was out near his lower snare lines, a mile from his cabin. A bear trap had sprung earlier in the day, and he needed to secure it before the snow buried it until spring. He wore a heavy coat of buffalo hide, snowshoes, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the stinging wind. Buster suddenly stopped, his hackles raising. The great dog let out a low whine, his nose pointed toward a cluster of ancient spruce trees off the trail. "What is it, boy?" Gideon shouted over the wind, adjusting the lever-action rifle slung over his shoulder. "Wolf?" Buster barked once, a sharp sound that meant something different. The dog bounded off the trail, sinking deep into the powder. Gideon followed, his snowshoes keeping him afloat on the drifts. When Gideon reached the trees, Buster was frantically digging at a mound of snow. Gideon approached, expecting to find a frozen deer or a lost calf. Instead, the dog's paws uncovered a patch of torn canvas fabric. Gideon dropped to his knees, sweeping the snow away with his thick leather gloves. His heart, usually slow and steady, hammered against his ribs. It was a girl. She was curled into a tight ball, her skin the color of marble, her lips bruised purple. Ice had formed in her dark eyelashes, and she wore no coat, only a pathetic, thin dress that offered no protection against a storm that could kill a grown elk. He ripped off his gloves and pressed his bare fingers against the side of her neck. The flesh was shockingly cold, like touching a corpse in a meat locker. For a terrifying second, he thought he was too late, but then, very faintly, he felt it. A slow, sluggish pulse. Thump, thump. "Lord above," Gideon muttered, his deep voice swallowed by the storm. There was no time to think. Gideon shrugged out of his massive buffalo hide coat, wrapping the heavy fur-lined garment around the girl's rigid body. He scooped her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, shockingly frail. "Lead the way, Buster, go!" Gideon commanded. The trek back to the cabin was an agonizing battle against the elements. The wind tried to push him off the mountain, blowing blinding sheets of ice into his eyes. His own body temperature plummeted without his coat, but he held the girl tight against his chest, transferring whatever body heat he could spare. He kicked open the heavy door of his cabin, the wind violently blowing snow across the threshold before he managed to slam it shut and drop the iron bar. The cabin was a single, large room, incredibly sturdy, smelling intensely of pine resin, cured leather, and wood smoke. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, roaring with a fierce fire that Gideon had stoked before leaving. He carried Josie to the large bed in the corner, covered in bear and elk pelts. He knew from harsh experience that heating her up too fast would shock her heart into stopping. He didn't put her directly by the fire. Instead, he piled the heavy furs on top of her. He heated a kettle of water, soaking rags in warm, not hot water, and gently began to press them to her frozen hands and face, wiping away the soot and ice. As the ice melted from her features, Gideon got a good look at her. She was young, far too young to be wandering the high peaks alone. Her face was hollowed by malnutrition, her hands calloused and raw from hard labor. This wasn't a rich man's daughter lost on a sleigh ride. This was a girl who had known nothing but a hard life. For 2 days the storm raged outside, trapping them in the cabin. For 2 days Josie drifted between life and death. The fever took her, causing her to thrash under the furs, crying out in delirium. "Don't let him touch me," she sobbed in the grip of the fever, her blind hands clawing at the blankets. "Mother, please. $42. I'll work harder." Gideon sat by the bed in a wooden rocking chair, listening to the fragmented horrors spilling from her lips. The mountain man, who had seen the worst of humanity on the battlefields, felt a dark, cold anger settling in his gut. He pieced together the story from her fevered ramblings. A mother, a sale, $42. A man waiting in a room. He didn't know her name, but he knew the monster she was running from. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally died down. The sun broke through the clouds, reflecting blindingly off the fresh, untouched snow outside the frosted window panes. Gideon was at the cast-iron stove, quietly stirring a pot of venison broth, when he heard a sharp intake of breath behind him. He turned slowly. Josie was awake. She had pushed herself up into the corner of the bed, dragging the thick bear pelt up to her chin. Her one good eye was wide, darting around the rustic cabin, taking in the drying traps, the mounted deer antlers, the heavy rifles on the wall, and finally, the massive, scarred man standing by the stove. Pure, unadulterated terror radiated from her trembling frame. Gideon didn't approach her. He knew better than to corner a terrified animal. He stayed by the stove, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "You're safe," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the quiet cabin. "You're high up on Gray's Peak. The storm passed." Josie's voice was barely a croak, shredded from the cold and the screaming. Who are you? Where is Sweeney?" "My name is Gideon Cross," he replied, pouring a measure of the rich broth into a tin cup. "I don't know who Sweeney is, but unless he's got wings and a death wish, he isn't coming up this mountain." Josie stared at him, her mind struggling to process the reality. She wasn't dead. She wasn't in the Silver Nugget. She was at the top of the world, alone with a giant of a man whose face looked like it had been carved with a hunting knife. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" I don't have anything. I'm useless." Gideon paused. He looked at the frail girl, remembering the words she had cried out in her sleep. He walked over, stopping a respectful distance from the bed, and set the steaming cup of broth on a small wooden table within her reach. "My dog found you buried in a snowdrift," Gideon said softly, looking her dead in the eye. "I brought you here so you wouldn't freeze to death. As for what I want," he stepped back, gesturing to the cup, "I want you to drink that broth before it gets cold. We can figure out the rest when you have the strength to stand." For the first time in her 19 years, Josephine Miller looked into the eyes of a man and saw no cruelty, no calculation, and no price tag. She saw only the quiet strength of the mountain itself, and as she reached a trembling hand out for the warm tin cup, she realized her old life was dead, buried in the snows far below. The winter of 1876 held Gray's Peak in an icy stranglehold for 4 unforging months. For Josephine, those months were a slow, agonizing process of unlearning a lifetime of cruelty. At first, her survival instincts manifested in a desperate, frantic need to prove she wasn't a burden. As soon as she was able to stand without her knees buckling, she began scouring the cabin for chores. She would wake before dawn, her bad leg aching fiercely in the morning cold, to sweep the rough-hewn floorboards, mend Gideon's torn work shirts with precise, tiny stitches, and attempt to cook complex meals from their limited stores of dried beans and salted venison. She flinched whenever Gideon moved too quickly. If a plate clattered to the floor, she would instantly shrink into herself, apologizing profusely, waiting for the backhand or the verbal lashing that had always followed mistakes in her mother's house. Gideon Cross watched this with a quiet, simmering sorrow. He recognized the ghosts in her eyes. They were the same ghosts he had seen in the eyes of young recruits after the bloodbaths of Shiloh and Antietam, the hollow, haunted look of a soul waiting for the next blow to fall. The breaking point arrived in late January. Gideon had gone out to check the snare lines, leaving Josie at the cabin. Determined to be useful, she decided to split the week's firewood. The axe was far too heavy for her, and the frozen pine blocks were stubborn. For an hour, she hacked at the wood in the biting wind, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged gasps. Finally, as she swung the heavy iron head down, her weakened left leg simply gave out. She collapsed into the snow, the axe narrowly missing her shin. The pain in her hip was blinding, but it was eclipsed by a crushing wave of panic. Useless, the voice in her head hissed. You can't even chop wood. He's going to throw you out. That was how Gideon found her curled in the snowbank, sobbing uncontrollably, frantically trying to push herself back up with freezing, bleeding hands. Gideon dropped his rifle, crossing the yard in 3 massive strides. He didn't yell. He didn't chastise her. He simply knelt in the snow, removed his heavy leather gloves, and placed his large, warm hands firmly over her trembling ones, stopping her frantic movements. "Josephine," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through her panic. "Look at me." She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was just trying to earn my keep. Please don't send me back down. I'll do better. I'll work harder." "Josephine." The command was firmer this time, anchoring her. She slowly opened her eyes. Gideon was looking at her, his scarred face completely devoid of anger. "You don't owe me your labor for your life," Gideon told her, his gaze unwavering. "You ain't a ledger, Josie. There is no debt to pay here. I didn't pull you out of that snowdrift to turn you into a servant. I saved you because you deserve to live. But I have to be useful," she whispered, a tear freezing on her cheek. "If I'm not useful, why would you keep me?" Gideon sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the mountain. He stood up and effortlessly lifted her into his arms, carrying her back into the warmth of the cabin. He set her in the rocking chair by the fire and handed her a rough woolen blanket. "My whole life," Gideon said, staring into the roaring flames, "men have looked at me and only seen what I could do for them. In the war, I was a rifle. To the fur traders, I'm a pelt. To the world down there, human beings are just tools to be used until they break. I left that world behind because it makes monsters out of men. You are safe here, Josie. You eat when you're hungry. You rest when you're hurt. You don't have to buy your right to breathe in my house." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. It shattered something deep within her, a hardened shell of self-loathing that Ruth Miller had cultivated for years. For the first time, Josie cried not from fear, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. From that day forward, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. Josie stopped working out of terror and started working out of a genuine desire to build a life. Gideon taught her how to survive. He shortened the stock of an old lightweight Winchester, 44-40, so she could handle it without being knocked off her feet by the recoil. He taught her how to read the tracks of snowshoe hares, how to predict a coming storm by the smell of the wind, and how to pack a wound with yarrow. Buster, the massive half-wolf, became her shadow, sleeping at her crippled feet and resting his heavy head in her lap. She was healing. But the past was not done with her. In early March, a violent pounding on the heavy oak door shattered the peaceful isolation. Buster erupted into a vicious, terrifying snarl, his hair standing on end. Gideon grabbed his rifle, motioning for Josie to retreat into the shadows behind the stone chimney. He threw the heavy iron bar and pulled the door open. Standing on the porch, shivering and dusted in snow, was Ezekiel Zeke Farnham, a grizzled old trapper who ran lines on the neighboring ridges. "Lower the iron, Gideon," Zeke rasped, pushing his way inside toward the fire, smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and cheap whiskey. "Got caught in a squall near the pass. Nearly froze my boots to my feet." Gideon secured the door, his eyes narrow. "You're miles off your usual line, Zeke. What brings you to this side of the peak?" Zeke held his frozen hands out to the flames, his eyes darting around the cabin. They landed on the small pair of women's boots drying by the hearth, and then, inevitably, on the hem of Josie's skirt visible behind the stonework. "Word travels even in the dead of winter," Zeke said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "Greenwood is boiling over, Gideon. Bartholomew Sweeney is tearing the camp apart looking for a girl, a cripple. Says she stole $500 from his private safe before making a run for it." Josie gasped, stepping out from the shadows. "That's a lie. I never took a dime from him." Zeke turned, looking the slight, pale girl up and down. He let out a low whistle. "So it's true. You actually pulled her off the mountain." He looked back at Gideon, his expression grim. Sweeney ain't a man who takes an insult lightly. A girl escaping makes him look weak to the miners. If he looks weak, he loses his grip on the town. He found a scrap of her dress snagged on a coal chute out back, and a set of tracks heading up the miners' trail before the blizzard hit. He knows she didn't take the stagecoach. "Let him look," Gideon said, his voice as cold as the ice outside. "He won't find her here." "He's offering a bounty, Gideon," Zeke warned, pulling a crumpled hand-drawn poster from his coat. $100, dead or alive. He fabricated the theft so he could legally hire bushwhackers to hunt her down. As soon as the snow melts and the trails clear, half the degenerates in Colorado are going to be crawling up this mountain looking for that money. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. $100. It was a fortune. It was more than double what her mother had sold her for. Zeke looked at Gideon, then at Josie. "I ain't a bounty hunter, Gideon. You know me. But $100 makes men do terrible things. You can't keep her here. When the thaw comes, they'll find you." Gideon didn't flinch. He walked over to his storage chest, unlocked it, and pulled out 3 prime, perfectly cured silver fox pelts furs, worth well over $150 in Denver. He tossed them onto the table in front of Zeke. "You haven't seen anything, Zeke," Gideon said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You spent the night, drank my coffee, and went back to your lines." Zeke looked at the furs, then at the scarred giant of a man, and slowly nodded, stuffing the pelts into his pack. "I'm blind as a bat, Gideon. But my silence won't stop the spring. And spring is coming." April arrived not with warmth, but with mud, violent thunderstorms, and the relentless sound of rushing water as the deep snowpack began to bleed into the valleys. The timberline transformed from a pristine white sanctuary into a treacherous, slipping landscape of exposed rock and roaring creeks. With the thaw came the dread. Gideon became a man possessed. He fortified the cabin, reinforcing the shutters with thick iron bands and setting a perimeter of tripwires and deadfalls in the woods surrounding their clearing. He barely slept, spending his nights sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, his Winchester resting across his knees, listening to the darkness. Josie felt the guilt returning, threatening to choke her. "Gideon, please," she begged one evening, watching him sharpen a hunting knife until it gleamed like liquid mercury. "You have to let me go. I'll sneak down the other side of the mountain. I can make it to Denver. If they find me here, they'll kill you." Gideon paused, looking up at her. The harsh lines of his face softened. "We are not running, Josie. This is our home. Sweeney and his hired guns bleed just like any other animal. They step on this ridge. They don't step off." But Sweeney didn't send ordinary men. He sent Levi Cobb and Clayton Reeves, 2 former bushwhackers who made their living doing the dirty work that even corrupt lawmen wouldn't touch. They were trackers, ghost-like in the woods, and they didn't care about bringing the girl back alive. Sweeney just wanted the message sent. The ambush happened on a Tuesday, just as the sun was beginning to burn through the morning fog. Gideon was a quarter mile down the trail, checking the southern perimeter. Josie was inside the cabin, kneading biscuit dough, while Buster slept by the stove. Suddenly, Buster's head snapped up. He didn't growl. A silent, terrifying intensity washed over the dog. He trotted to the heavy wooden door and pressed his nose to the crack, his muscles coiled like springs. A split second later, the sharp, echoing crack of a high-caliber rifle shattered the morning stillness. It came from the south, from Gideon. Josie's heart stopped. The dough fell from her hands. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized her throat. Her first instinct, ingrained by 19 years of abuse, was to hide, to crawl under the bed, pull the pelts over her head, and pray the monsters didn't find her. Another shot rang out, followed by a heavy, booming return fire that she instantly recognized as Gideon's heavy buffalo rifle. A shootout had begun in the woods. "Useless," the voice echoed in her mind. "You are a stone around his neck. You brought death to his door." Josie looked at the corner of the room. There, leaning against the logs, was the shortened Winchester, 44 to 40 Gideon had customized for her. Beside it hung a bandolier of cartridges. She remembered Gideon's words in the snow. "You don't have to buy your right to breathe." He hadn't saved her so she could cower while he died for her. Josie wiped the flour from her hands. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands remarkably steady, and slung the heavy bandolier over her shoulder. "Come on, Buster," she whispered. She didn't go out the front door. Gideon had taught her better than that. She slipped out the reinforced back window, dropping into the muddy brush behind the cabin. Her bad leg throbbed with the sudden impact, but she forced the pain deep down into her chest, locking it away. She moved through the dense, dripping pines, following the sounds of sporadic gunfire. Buster stalked silently beside her, a lethal shadow. She crested a small ridge overlooking a rocky ravine. Below, the scene was chaotic. Gideon was pinned behind a massive fallen spruce tree. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, his coat soaked in dark, spreading blood. He was firing his revolver with his right hand, keeping the two bushwhackers at bay. Levi Cobb and Clayton Reeves were advancing slowly, using the rocky outcroppings for cover. They had the higher ground on Gideon, and it was only a matter of time before they flanked him completely. Josie was above them all. She had the vantage point, but she had never shot at a human being. Her breath hitched. Her hands began to shake violently. I can't do this." Down in the ravine, Reeves made a break for a closer rock, raising his rifle to draw a bead on Gideon's exposed flank. Gideon, weakened by blood loss, didn't see him in time. "He saved me," Josie thought, a fierce, blinding fire suddenly igniting in her chest, burning away the fear. "He is the only good thing in this world." Josie raised the Winchester. She nestled the stock against her cheek, ignoring the trembling, and aligned the iron sights exactly as Gideon had taught her. She didn't look at Reeves as a man. She looked at him as a wolf at the door. She exhaled slowly, holding her breath at the bottom of her lungs. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched her shoulder hard. The crack of the rifle was deafening. Down in the ravine, Clayton Reeves screamed as the .44 caliber slug shattered his collarbone, spinning him around and dropping him into the mud. The battlefield froze. Gideon looked up toward the ridge in shock. Levi Cobb whipped around, searching for the unseen shooter. Josie didn't freeze. She worked the lever action, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and chambered another round. She fired again, the bullet kicking up rock shards inches from Cobb's face. "Buster! Sick 'em!" Josie screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the canyon. The massive dog launched himself off the ridge like a furry missile, tearing down the slope with a terrifying primal roar. Cobb, panicking at the sight of the enraged half-wolf charging him and suppressing fire raining down from above, broke. He grabbed the wounded Reeves by his coat collar and dragged him backward, abandoning the hunt, scrambling wildly down the muddy trail toward the safety of the lower valleys. Josie kept her rifle trained on them until they disappeared from sight. Only then did she lower the weapon, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and shock. She scrambled down the slick, muddy slope, her bad leg giving way twice, sending her sliding into the brush. She didn't care. She reached the ravine and threw herself to her knees beside Gideon. He was pale, his breathing shallow. The bullet had passed clean through his left shoulder, missing the bone but tearing through the muscle. Josie tore a strip from her apron, her hands moving with frantic, focused precision. She packed the wound tight, tying the fabric off with a brutal knot to stem the bleeding. Gideon grunted in pain, his eyes locking onto hers. "You didn't hide," Gideon rasped, a faint, proud smile touching the corners of his pale lips. "I'm not useless," Josie said fiercely, her voice thick with emotion as she slipped her small shoulder under his good arm, preparing to bear his massive weight. "I'm not a stone around your neck, Gideon Cross. Now lean on me. We're going home." For the first time in her life, Josephine Miller wasn't being dragged into the dark. She was the one doing the pulling, hauling the man she loved out of the mud and blood, and walking him back up the mountain toward the light. The extraction of the bullet from Gideon's shoulder was a gruesome, desperate affair that tested the very limits of Josie's newfound resolve. The heavy .44 caliber slug had shattered against his scapula, leaving jagged lead fragments buried deep within the torn muscle. Back in the safety of the cabin, with the heavy iron bar dropped firmly across the door, the true horror of their situation settled in. Gideon was fading fast. The blood loss was severe. His usually ruddy, weathered face drained to the color of dirty snow. He lay on the large bed, sweating profusely, his massive frame shivering with the onset of shock. "Josie," he rasped, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He gestured weakly with his good hand toward a small, iron-bound chest at the foot of the bed. "The knife. The whiskey. You have to get the lead out, or the rot will take the arm. Maybe the rest of me." Josie's hands trembled so violently she could barely turn the latch on the chest. She found the surgical kit a grim relic from Gideon's time in the infantry, and a half-full bottle of cheap raw rye whiskey. She stoked the fire until it roared, plunging the steel forceps and a scalpel into a pot of boiling water. She remembered the terrified, useless girl who had been sold for $42. That girl would have curled up in the corner and let him die. But that girl was dead, buried under the winter snows. "Hold on, Buster," she whispered to the great half-wolf, who was whining anxiously at the foot of the bed. She poured the biting whiskey directly into Gideon's open wound. He let out a strangled, agonizing roar, his back arching off the mattress. Josie didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the bed beside him, pinning his good shoulder down with her knee, and went to work. It was a butchery born of love. She dug into the torn flesh with the sterilized forceps, ignoring the slippery slickness of his blood, guided only by the desperate need to save the only person who had ever treated her like a human being. It took an hour to extract 3 mangled pieces of lead. When she finally bound the wound with clean linen and a heavy poultice of yarrow and pine pitch, Gideon had passed out from the pain. For the next 2 weeks, the roles were entirely reversed. Josie became the protector of the high peaks. She chopped the wood, her muscles hardening with every swing of the axe. She took Gideon's heavy rifle and hunted snowshoe hares and ptarmigan, her aim steady and true. She stood guard at the window during the long, dark nights, Buster at her side, watching the tree line for any sign of Sweeney's men returning. They didn't return. Levi Cobb and Clayton Reeves had learned that the ghost of Gray's Peak was heavily armed, and his woman was a dead shot. As summer washed over the Rockies, turning the alpine meadows into brilliant canvases of purple columbine and yellow paintbrush, Gideon slowly regained his strength. The near-death experience had stripped away the last of the emotional walls between them. In the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, they talked. Gideon spoke of the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, of the senseless slaughter that had driven him to seek the silence of the mountains. Josie spoke of her father, of the slow, crushing poverty that had eroded her mother's soul until nothing but cruelty remained. They were 2 broken things that, when pressed together, somehow formed a solid, unbreakable whole. But their hard-won peace was a fragile illusion. The reality of the world below arrived in late August, not with gunfire, but with the sharp, methodical rapping of knuckles on their front door. Josie instantly reached for her Winchester, but Gideon, his left arm resting in a leather sling, put a gentle hand on her shoulder. He walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was a man who clearly did not belong in the wild. He wore a sharply tailored, albeit dust-covered charcoal suit, a black bowler hat, and round, wire-rimmed spectacles. He was unarmed, holding his hands open and away from his sides. "Gideon Cross?" the man asked, his voice crisp and educated, carrying the unmistakable accent of a Bostonian. "And Miss Josephine Miller? Who's asking?" Gideon rumbled, his body blocking Josie from view. "My name is Harrison Finch," the man said, reaching slowly into his breast pocket and producing a gleaming silver badge. "I am an operative with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. I have been tracking you both for 3 weeks. I assure you, Mr. Cross, I am not here for Bartholomew Sweeney's bounty. In fact, I am here to dismantle it." Gideon narrowed his eyes, stepping back to let the man inside. Finch stood by the fireplace, accepting a tin cup of coffee from Josie with a polite nod. "Sweeney overplayed his hand," Finch explained, pulling a small leather notebook from his coat. "When his hired bushwhackers came back wounded, rambling about a wild man and a girl with a rifle, Sweeney decided to use the law. He bribed a territorial judge in Denver to issue a federal warrant for Miss Miller's arrest, claiming the sum stolen was not $500, but $5,000 money he claims belonged to a federal mail shipment he was safeguarding." Josie gasped. the color draining from her face. "That's insane. It's a lie." "I am fully aware of that, Miss Miller," Finch said calmly. "The Pinkerton Agency has been building a racketeering and murder case against Sweeney for 6 months. The territorial governor wants his stranglehold on Greenwood broken, but Sweeney has the local sheriff in his pocket, and the miners are too terrified to testify against him." Finch looked squarely at Gideon. "I found Levi Cobb recuperating in a saloon in Idaho Springs. Under intense interrogation, he confessed that Sweeney hired them to murder you both, confirming Sweeney fabricated the theft to cover up human trafficking. But Cobb is a known liar and a convicted outlaw. His testimony won't hang Sweeney. What will?" Gideon asked, his jaw tightening. "Hers," Finch said, pointing his pen at Josie. "Miss Miller is the missing link. She is a victim of his trafficking ring who survived. If she is willing to walk into the federal courthouse in Denver and tell a grand jury exactly how she was sold, and how Sweeney attempted to have her hunted down to keep her quiet, we can bring the United States cavalry down on the Silver Nugget. We can end him." Silence heavy as lead filled the cabin. "No," Gideon said instantly, his voice a dangerous growl. "Sweeney owns that town. Taking her down that mountain is a death sentence. We'll stay here. We'll fight off whoever he sends." "You can't fight the federal government, Mr. Cross," Finch countered gently. "Right now, she is a wanted fugitive. If a U.S. Marshal finds you, they won't ask questions. They will shoot you and drag her to a cell. The only way she is ever truly free, the only way you both can live without looking over your shoulders, is to cut the snake's head off." Gideon looked at Josie. The fierce protective fire in his eyes warred with the agonizing realization that Finch was right. He couldn't keep her locked away on a mountain forever. Josie looked down at her hands, the same hands that had been blistered by Ruth Miller's lye soap, the same hands that had fired a rifle to save a man's life. She thought of the red dress waiting in that dark, windowless room. She thought of the other girls who hadn't been lucky enough to find a coal chute. "When do we leave, Mr. Finch?" Josie asked, her voice ringing with a quiet, terrifying authority. Gideon looked at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of immense pride and profound dread. He didn't argue. He simply went to the wall, took down his heavy gun belt, and began checking the cylinders of his revolvers. The descent into Greenwood in early September felt like walking into the mouth of hell. The crisp, clean air of the alpine timberline gave way to the suffocating stench of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and raw sewage. They did not sneak into town. They rode in the front of a rented buckboard wagon, driven by Harrison Finch. Gideon sat tall in the back, his heavy buffalo coat pushed back to reveal the twin revolvers holstered at his hips, his Winchester resting across his knees. Beside him sat Josephine. She did not wear rags. She wore a simple, well-made dress of dark blue wool that Gideon had purchased through a catalog, her head held high, her spine straight. She did not try to hide her limp as she eventually stepped down from the wagon. She wore it as a badge of survival. Word of their arrival spread through the muddy streets like a brush fire. Miners stopped in their tracks, dropping their picks and shovels. Women peered out from behind the dusty glass of the mercantile. Everyone recognized the scarred giant from the mountain, and everyone recognized the girl who was supposed to be dead. Finch parked the wagon directly in front of the Silver Nugget. The massive saloon, usually roaring with drunken laughter, fell deathly silent as Gideon pushed the swinging saloon doors open, stepping aside to let Josie enter first. Finch followed close behind, his hand resting casually inside his suit jacket. The air inside was thick with stale cigar, smoke, and fear. At the back of the room, sitting at a private faro table flanked by 4 heavily armed thugs, was Bartholomew Sweeney. The saloon owner had grown fatter in the past year, his face flushed with cheap liquor and unchecked power. When Sweeney saw Josie, the cigar dropped from his slack jaw, burning a hole in the green felt of the card table. "Well, I'll be damned," Sweeney breathed, his piggy eyes darting from Josie to the heavily armed giant beside her. The little cripple comes crawling back, and she brought the mountain freak with her. He snapped his fingers at his thugs. "Take 'em." The girl goes out back. "Shoot the big one and the dandy in the suit." The thugs drew their weapons, but Gideon was faster. In a blur of motion that defied his massive size, Gideon's Winchester was up and leveled directly at Sweeney's chest. The first man who pulls a hammer back dies before the sound reaches his ears. Gideon roared, his voice shaking the dust from the chandeliers. "Stand down, gentlemen," Finch shouted, pulling his Pinkerton badge from his pocket and holding it high for the entire saloon to see. "I am Agent Finch, federal detective. The building is surrounded by 20 deputized men. Bartholomew Sweeney. You are under arrest for mail fraud, human trafficking, and the attempted murder of Josephine Miller." Sweeney scoffed, a nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You've got nothing, Pinkerton. This is my town. This girl is a thief. She stole $5,000 from me. I bought her labor fair and square from her mother. A contract of slavery is not legally binding in the state of Colorado, Sweeney," Finch said smoothly, stepping forward with a pair of heavy iron handcuffs. "And as for the theft, Levi Cobb has given a full, signed confession to a federal judge detailing exactly how much you paid him to fabricate the story and kill this young woman." Sweeney's face drained of color. He looked around the room, realizing the miners were not stepping up to defend him. His empire of fear was crumbling in the face of federal authority and the unflinching stare of Gideon Cross. "You think you're something special, Josie?" Sweeney spat venomously as Finch clamped the irons around his thick wrists. "You're nothing. You're trash. Your own mother sold you for drinking money." "I know," Josie said, her voice piercing the silence of the saloon. It was calm, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. She stepped closer to the captured man, and that was the greatest favor she ever did me. As Sweeney was dragged toward the door, a commotion broke out near the back hallway. A woman stumbled out, carrying a heavy wooden bucket of dirty mop water. She was rail-thin, her hair gray and unkempt, wearing a filthy, tattered dress. Josie froze. It was Ruth Miller. The woman who had sold her daughter to buy a stagecoach ticket to Denver had apparently found no fortune in the city. Chewed up and spat out by the harsh reality of the frontier, Ruth had crawled back to Greenwood, forced to take the very job, the scrubbing of Sweeney's floors, that she had condemned her daughter to. Ruth dropped the bucket, the dirty water splashing across her ruined boots. She stared at Josie, at her clean clothes, her healthy complexion, and the tall, imposing man who stood beside her, with a protective hand hovering near the small of her back. "Josephine," Ruth whispered, her voice cracking, reaching out a trembling, prune-wrinkled hand. "Josie, is that you? They told me you froze to death." Josie looked at her mother. A year ago, this woman's approval had meant the world to her. A year ago, this woman's cruelty had defined her worth. Now, looking at the broken, bitter shell of a woman scrubbing saloon floors, Josie felt no anger. She felt only a profound, hollow pity. "Josephine died in the snow, Mrs. Miller," Josie said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I am Josie Cross now." She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on her mother, took Gideon's massive, scarred hand in her own, and walked out of the Silver Nugget into the bright, blinding light of the Colorado afternoon. The price of $42 was meant to be the final, degrading measure of Josephine's worth, a crude calculation by a mother who saw her child as nothing more than a broken burden. Yet in the brutal crucible of the Rocky Mountains, that exact sum became the catalyst for a magnificent resurrection. Josephine and Gideon, two souls discarded and scarred by the cruelty of the civilized world, found in each other an immeasurable, enduring value that no silver baron could ever purchase. They chose to build their family not on bloodlines or ledgers, but on mutual salvation, grit, and an unwavering respect forged in the fires of survival. Returning to the silence of Gray's Peak, they left the ghosts of Greenwood in the dust, their legacy a testament to the truth that a human soul is never useless, and that the deepest love is often found where the world forgets to look.